Welcome to Sodankylä, director Karim Aïnouz.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And welcome to Keski-Pohjanmaan Kino vlog. And we usually ask our guests, what is your favorite film and what are your favorite films and what are your favorite TV shows if you have time to watch TV?
I think my favorite film is a film called Fear Eats the Soul by Hannu Björkbacka. Yeah, I think it's from 1973. And my favorite TV show, I think my favorite TV show, I don't really watch much TV shows, but I think I remember watching Chernobyl and liking it a lot, and I think Twin Peaks is also probably one of my favorite. The first season was my favorite.
Yes, wonderful, yeah. And also a bonus question for our vlog. Can you please, even if it's cold outside at the moment in Sodankylä, say something nice about Finland, Sodankylä and Juho Kuosmanen?
Oh, that's very sweet. About Finland, it's my second time here, and it's my first time not in Helsinki, because the first time was there. And I don't know, there's something that I feel it's a very far away country for me, but I feel very familiar. There's something very warm about, we think of Scandinavia as something very cold and distant, and it's sort of the opposite here. I feel that there's a sense of rhythm that's very much close to my culture. So I think I feel always very at home and very warm.
Right.
It's really, and about being here, it's really interesting because I feel that it's sort of the antipode of where I come from. Where I come from, it's very hot and dry and barren, and here it's kind of the same, but a bit colder, so a lot colder actually. So there is a sense of familiarity when I walk around in the streets and I see, the city and the houses and the gas stations and the road. So it feels very close to where I come from in a way, but on another latitude.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel far.
Yeah. What about you have been on many festivals. How is the Sodankylä festival compared to that? Is it different?
Well, it's very horizontal, which I think it's really great. I was thinking yesterday that sometimes you go to festivals and you just remember the hotels because they're just the same, And I think here, I'll remember the people in the films, and there's a sense that you can. It reminds me a bit on a different scale of the Havana Film Festival, because it's very informal and you just cross people and you spend time with people.
No red carpets or prizes.
No, but film and also a love for film, and one of the beautiful things about film festival is meeting people. So.
True.
That's what's been so great about being here.
And what about Juho?
He is such a sweet, more than sweet, he's such a talented filmmaker. And it's very, very funny because I remember him calling me a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2020, wanting to show my film. And I said, who is this person calling me and stuff? And then I saw his film and I was really, really, really touched by it and moved by it and excited by it. And then we've been in touch since then, and we met in Cannes when he showed Compartment Number 6, and it was such a great encounter. I felt like I've known him for many years, and I've just met him a couple of times. Yeah. And it was wonderful because, yesterday I saw this woman that I thought, this woman looks so incredibly powerful and beautiful, walk into the hotel, and then this morning I woke up and it was the main actress of Compartment Number 6. So it's like a second coincidence. So. Yeah, it's funny. There's a sense of, as I told you before, there's a sense of familiarity, people that you meet, that you feel like you've met them a long time ago, but actually you just met them. So there is this sense. But I think it's in his films. There's so much love for life in his films that I think that's where I connected with him.
Great. And now, would you sign our festival catalog for us, please?
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Jean-Paul Belmondo.
Ollaanko me vippejä? Ollaan.
Melkein mä oon vipannut paljon.
Okay. Good morning. Hyvää huomenta kaikille. And please welcome one of the most versatile, important, and interesting, exciting, and cosmopolitan Brazilian directors of today, Karim Aïnouz.
Thank you. That's very promising.
Overselling you.
Thank you.
The classic first question. What was the first film you ever saw?
It's a really difficult question. I can't really remember because I was not going to the movies very much when I was a kid. So I think the first movie that I remember that had a strong impact on me, I think, was Saturday Night Fever. Because it was such a liberating experience. It was like going to a club, you know, being underage or something like that, and it was really alive. And we didn't really get many Brazilian films playing when I was growing up. It was a lot of American cinema, mostly American cinema. And then I remember when I was a teenager seeing, I think it was The Sacrifice from Tarkovsky, and that really, I know it's a very different, kind of the opposite from Saturday Night Fever, but it really made a huge impression on me because, you know, it was so different than everything I had ever seen. But growing up in Brazil, you didn't really go to the cinema, you saw a lot of TV. So it was very rare. But I remember very much going with my mom to see Saturday Night Fever, and there was something very joyful about it that I really, really, really adored. Yeah.
Sorry. Anteeksi, tässä on jonkun mikki ja tästä tulee tää tulkkaus ja häiritsee jo valtavasti, että tästä ei vaan kuule. Kiitos. So was it telenovelas or?
It was a lot of telenovelas. It was 5 telenovelas a day. It was a nightmare. Yeah. I mean, it was sort of a nightmare. I mean, that's what we had. I mean, it was expensive going to the cinema. My mother worked all week long, and so we could only go like on Sundays sometimes. And so TV was the military years, and you know the telenovelas were booming. Really, it was a way to keep people home, and so there was a lot of telenovelas, and it was quite. They were interesting at the time. I mean, the early 70s. It was the beginning of the telenovela, so a lot of the actors that were in theater, the main theater actors, the really great theater actors, and radio actors that did radio novelas came to TV. So there was a couple of very interesting, not a couple, there were many interesting soap operas, but there was a lot, like there was 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and 10 o'clock. There were 4 a day for 8 months each. So it was a bit of an overdose. But that's what we had, and so going to the cinema was something that didn't really happen until I think I was like 15 or 16.
And describe what kind of childhood did you have? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up, I was born in a city and grew up in a city called Fortaleza, which is in the northern part of Brazil. It's sort of right, I think it's 3 degrees under the equator, so it's like very, very dry, very sunny. That's why I love being here, even if it's cold. It's true, like I had so much sun in my life that I really love like cold places and snowy places, because the light was on all the time, you know, it was very, very strong light. But I grew up there. I was born in the late 60s, and I stayed there until I was 17, and then I went to university in Brasilia, which is the capital city, until I was 21. But I basically grew up in this very beautiful, sunny incredible city. It was a very small place at the time because there were no flights, not many flights between there and Rio and São Paulo. So it was sort of very isolated. It's interesting, it was very isolated, but yet there was a big sea ahead of us, so you could also dream of what was beyond the sea. But it was a really isolated place. And it was a place where people in the south, which is where the big cities are, they treated us very, very badly, you know, because we had this funny accent and we spoke like singing, and so it was the backwaters of the country. But it was great. We had great memories of it.
And you made films about your parents as well. What did they do?
Yeah, so you're going to know a lot about my parents in this movie that's going to play today at whatever, at 1 o'clock here. It's really about them. My mom was a scientist. She was a biochemist. She researched vegetable physiology of plants and proteins. She was a researcher and a professor. And my dad is an engineer. He's an hydraulic engineer. And she was from Fortaleza. She was born and raised there. And my dad is from Kabylie, which is the mountains in the northern part of Algeria. It's a great story, the way they met and stuff. But I was basically, yes, so my mother, I had nothing to do with cinema. And I actually never thought I would make films until I was in my early 20s. And so it's a family that was basically science, sort of, you know, mostly science really, the two of them. And mathematics. My grandparents from my father's side was math teachers. And from my mother's side, my grandmother was a seamstress.
You mentioned that you could only go to the cinema on Sundays because your mom worked a lot.
Yeah.
What about your father? You didn't go with him?
No, actually I was raised, my father left us, so I was raised by my mother, only so she was a single mother. And I was raised by my mother and my grandmother. So I used to, my mother worked all day at university, and I would stay home after school with my grandmother, so there was no father involved. The only days that she had free, so our routine was she worked all day, so she left home in the morning, came back in the evening. I would stay with my grandmother. On Saturdays we would go out to do some shopping, because she needed to do some shopping for the house. And then on Sundays sometimes we used to go to the cinema, but very rarely. Because she was super tired, so either we did something in the neighborhood or we went somewhere around the house. But yes, I was, she was sort of the man of the house. She was the mother and the father at the same time, so she was really working a lot.
You grew up basically during the dictatorship, the younger years. What kind of period was that for your family?
Yeah, it's crazy because I was, my mother was not directly involved in the movements of liberation at that time, but her students were. So it was very close to us in the sense of, you know, all these stories of the military going into people's houses and going to their books, and so it was a very tense moment in the country. And I sensed it not directly because I had no relatives who were missing or who were tortured or who disappeared, but a lot of my mother's friends had been, and particularly a couple of students of her had been, they were just kidnapped in the military and then they were killed and disappeared forever. So it was a very strange time, but I was very young, you know, so I was, when the military came out of power, which was in 1979, I was 13, so it was the moment I was born into, until I became a sort of a young teenager. But I have this very, it's a very strange memory because it was very present, but yet I don't have exactly, I remember this feeling of being very, there was this sort of movement of people being very nationalist and very, soccer was a really big instrument of the military against what was happening. So there was this sense of national identity and of pride and stuff because of the World Cup in 1970. And that I remember very well. And it was the moment that we sort of loved being Brazilians, and there was these things written everywhere. It's like saying either love Brazil Brazil or leave Brazil, and also was this very clearly frontal propaganda for the military at the time. And talking about cinema and telenovelas, the telenovelas were clearly being made to tame people, to keep people home, and to sort of, do the bad job that sometimes cinema can do, like escapism. But so my memories are very thin. I just remember these events that I told you. But I did something very strange during the military years, which I kind of regret and don't regret. So I actually entered a military school in 1976 because there was a way, my mother was such a left-wing woman that I was a way to rebel from her. I asked her to apply for military school, and I was 9 years old, and she said, "You gotta be kidding me." And I said, no, I'm not kidding you. Because it was the best place to study mathematics and physics, which is what I really loved. Sort of the best school, but it was really it was a bad act of rebellion. So I got into that school, and after 1 year, it was really hard for her because every person at university thought that she had really badly educated me. Like everybody from her team and from her friends, thought like, "What's wrong with your child?" Like she was ashamed. And then after 1 year at military school, I wanted to leave. Obviously, it was horrible. And she said, now that you're able to the end. And it was interesting. I totally understand. I was being raised in a family only with, there was only women around me, so I needed some, male presence, and also a way to rebel like that. But it was quite helpful being a director now to have been in a military school. It's a bit to do with that when you have a crew. But, so it was a really interesting moment, those years of, I'm kidding, but it was a really interesting moment, those years of dictatorship, because in one hand, from sort of my close friends, to my mother and my grandmother, there was a lot of people suffering and going through really horrible stuff. And I was like going every day right to the trenches, to the place where these people were. So it was an interesting moment for me. It was a horrible moment for the country, really.
It's an interesting spectrum from Saturday Night Fever to
I know.
Were there any Brazilian filmmakers or Brazilian cinema that you responded to?
Yeah, listen, what happened was, so I didn't really go to the cinema when I was young. I didn't really want to make films, and she was much older. And it was never a profession. It was something that was very, very rare. I never met anybody who made films, and she was an adult. So, but when I entered university, there was a film club which was run by somebody who had a cinema, and I'm a film club sort of child. So when I was 17, I went to university. Then I really started to binge on films, and then I discovered. So there are actually 2 films when I was growing up. It's even more shocking. It's Saturday Night Fever and a movie called Fame. which is really fun. With Donna Summer at the end, it was really wonderful. But when I entered university, I started to go through this film club, which was really formative for me. Still, I didn't want to make films at the time, but I really started to discover Brazilian filmmakers. So there was a filmmaker who I really... there was 2 movements happening in Brazil in the 1960s. One is called Cinema Novo, which is much more rural and a little macho for my taste. And then there was something called the underground movement in São Paulo, which was really interesting and very interesting film. So it's the first time that I saw Brazilian films. And there was one movie that really, really touched me a lot. When you ask the first movie that I saw, I think the first Brazilian movie that really touched me a lot is a movie called The Hour of the Star, which is a movie that was made in 1985 that actually won the Berlin Film Festival. And it's really, really incredible, beautiful. One of the first Brazilian female directors, actually, based on a beautiful book, and that's the movie that really touched me. And then I started to see a lot of European cinema. In this cine club, they were doing sort of these retrospectives of authors. So that's how I discovered a lot of the people that came to influence me at the time. And I think the one that really just jumped into the end of this when said what movie I would take to an island. I would take... Spoiler! I'll give you a tip. There was a German filmmaker that really changed my life, and there was a lot of other mostly European filmmakers that I discovered, and I really sort of started to understand why I was so much touched by cinema, but it was at that time. But it is contradictory, right? I mean, it is being raised in a country like Brazil. I mean, it's so contradictory. Everything is just so unexpected. But yet, I am very proud of having loved Saturday Night Fever. I love dancing, and I think there was something about that film that really contaminated every film I've made since I started making films, which is, I don't think I can ever make a movie without a dance scene. You know, it's really the moment of joy and celebration, and I think it literally comes from John Travolta sort of sliding through the blinking lines of that dance floor that really stayed with me.
What kind of opportunities were there for filmmakers or young people aspiring to be filmmakers? Were there any, or was that part of the reason we were?
None. I mean, it was where I grew up. It was just not, it didn't exist. And I think the first people that I met didn't really, I mean, making films was something that was not, it was just not, it was impossible. In Rio and São Paulo, there were people making films, there was funding, and it was very concentrated there, but where I came from, we couldn't even get negative shit there, you know, so there was maybe one movie made there during the 70s, so it was not really my radar. So there were no opportunities. The first people that I met that went to film school were 3 friends from my generation that went to film school in Cuba. So that was the first people that I met that actually studied film, and that was in 1980, maybe 1988 to 1989. So it was not a profession, and there was nothing. There was no work in film, not even television. So you had to move to Rio, São Paulo, and I did have a friend who is still a friend today, who went to school in São Paulo, but that was not something that we could afford. You know, it was just really impossible.
So then you went to study architecture instead. What drew you into architecture?
Well, again, another contradiction. I really didn't want to study architecture, but I wanted to study sociology because I left military school, and it was, I think it was the year that the military left. It was just a couple of years later. And it was a moment of explosion in the country, you know, like there was a sense like we can take the country back, and there was a sense of joy, and all the left-wing movements sort of exploded, you know, in Brazil at the time. And I went to university in a place where there was a lot of activist movements happening, and so I wanted to study sociology. That's what I wanted to study. I had read Marx, and my mind was racing, and I wanted to change the world, and sociology was the place that I could sort of, it was the space, the sort of academic space I could enter, and maybe become a politician or impact more change in the world. But my mother said, you gotta be kidding me, like sociology is not serious enough, so you need to do something which is serious. She was a very practical lady. And I always loved painting, but I knew I wasn't a good painter. And architecture is the sort of gray zone when you're a teenager, you don't really know what you want to do. It's this sort of space that you can go, and it's good. You know, I was very good with mathematics. I loved painting, you know, art history. So I never really was interested in architecture at all. It was a place that I could go and keep face, you know, like to the family, and it's something that I probably could get a job afterwards. So I studied architecture for 5 years, and I actually really got into not architecture itself, but urban planning, because there was such a shortage of housing in Brazil. There's still a lot, but at the time it's huge, so there was a lot of stuff that one could do politically in terms of urban planning, so that was really exciting for me when I was studying architecture. But there was never really a dream to go and study architecture. Really, a dream was either sociology or then to go to a fine arts or visual arts school, because I really love painting. But that was also not it was not an option. And then And then I really got into urban planning, and it was really great to have been into that school and to have done. But it took a long time for things to get done, and I slowly shifted from that to photography, and then I started to do a lot of photography. But I never really quit architecture for a long time.
Fernando Meirelles, who was here the last time we had a physical festival, he's also an architect.
Yeah.
Do you ever get together and
Yeah.
buildings?
Only cinema, we never did. It was a generational thing, you know, like in the early 80s or mid 80s, in a country like Brazil, there are a few, if you're, you know, you're coming from a middle class family, there are a few things you could do that actually could get you work, you know, at the end of the day. And architecture was one which was the most fun one, because you were exposed to so many different things, you know, that it was the sort of best address to go if you didn't really have an address. And so my generation, I'm a little bit younger, but not really much than Fernando, so a lot of those kids from that generation, they migrated from architecture to a bunch of other things. So Fernando, when he finished architecture school, I think he did a lot of video work and like commercials, and so it was a sort of a basis that allowed us to sort of jump to different places. And the schools are really wonderful. A lot of the people, you know, they were very left-wing, they were very liberal. There were spaces where people were experimenting with different things, so they were really great spaces to be in as a young adult or as a teenager going to university. You know, they were really, really privileged, intellectually really interesting and exciting places. So it was good for that.
You've also made a few documentaries about architecture.
Yeah.
And it's one of the hardest things to do. I think you pull it off, but it's like talking about dance. Writing about dance.
Yeah.
It's very strange. So are there any good documentaries besides your work about architecture?
I don't really see documentaries about architecture, and the two documentaries I did about architecture, so I don't know, and I don't know. Not about it, you know. I think that I love the way that, for example, so funny. The first person that comes to mind when I think about architecture and cinema is Antonioni. I think there's a real sense of space in what he does, what he did, which is really, really incredibly magic almost. But I don't really know any. No, this is a series, I think, in French TV made by this production company called the Film d'ici, which really deals with architecture, which is really interesting. But yeah, it's not magic, you know, like architecture. The architecture experience can be magic when you enter a building, when you are in a space. I don't really recall, and I did make two films which are very strongly inspired by architecture. One in particular, there was a commission about a building, and the other one, which was about this a building as well, became about something else. So I think it's a really difficult subject to grasp, you know, in cinema. And everybody says, you know, what do you bring from architecture when you started to make films? But not a lot, actually. I don't even remember I studied architecture when making films, because it became so much about characters than space, in a way. So
tell us how does a Brazilian architect student end up in the US working with Todd Haynes?
That's a detour. No, I finished school and I was 21, I think, when I finished university. I started a little early, and I just wanted to leave the country. I just wanted to go away, you know, as a small town boy, you know, like as a gay man at the time, living in a really far away place. I just wanted to escape, you know, and be anonymous and go to a big city and disappear. And that's what I did. I got a grant to go to university in New York. Never really thought of living in the US. My dream was always to sort of escape and live in France or in Europe, but I ended up having this opportunity and I went to New York, and it was a really exciting time. And I didn't really want to do anything besides have a good time when I went there. It was in 1989, it was it's a very sad time because it was sort of the booming of the AIDS epidemic. But at the same time, it was a really exciting time. And so I went there, and I started to do this master's in architecture, and I got some money from my friend, from my dad actually, and I really just wanted to party, and I just wanted to have a good time. And then I started to discover photography and Super 8. And I slowly left architecture, and I started, and I really discovered, that's when I really discovered the power of cinema when I was living there at the time. There was so many films being made. Oh wait, there's a movie that I really loved too, that I forgot to tell, which is Zed by Costa Graves, which was a really important film as well, because it talks so much about what I was living at the time in Brazil. But anyway, that's a footnote. Going back to the US. So I was living there, it was a really exciting time, and I just, for the first time, I felt really, really free, and I started to do things that I never thought I could do, which is taking pictures and making Super 8 films. I was really interested in experimental cinema. It was something that for me was really fascinating. And I lived in a tiny apartment. In the street that I lived, there was this film workshop that they taught you how to develop Super 8 film and to edit Super 8 film, and just, it was something that really moved me. And I've always loved photography. And I slowly drifted from cinema from architecture to film studies. So I never, again, it's true, I didn't really want to make films. I wanted to study films because it was a really interesting field of study, and I loved watching films at that time. And there was something, there was a shift. I lived so there was this film workshop, and there was a video store, which was literally down from my building. It's, for those who know New York, it was called Kim's Video. And I would watch, it was like having a movie today. But you know, there was the movie shop down from your apartment. So I would rent VHS of like incredible films that I could never see anywhere else. And I really fell in love with it, and I started to study film. And I just got really curious about it. And coupled with that, it was also a moment in American independent cinema where cinema was politically very relevant. You know, there were films being made that I think really had an impact on the world, particularly at that moment. So I was really taken by it, and I started to work as an assistant. So I remember seeing this workshop that was close to my home. I remember watching a movie called Superstar. Of those of you who haven't seen it, you should see it. It sounds strange by the description. It's the story of Karen Carpenter from the Carpenters, the group. But it's really beautifully, it's made only with Barbie dolls. It's so original. And it was really about how sort of she was killed by machismo, and it's really about anorexia. And I saw this film, and I was blown away, and I thought, wow, maybe I don't need so much money. You know, maybe I need a Super 8 camera, I need some dolls, I need a good idea, like maybe I can make a movie. And I was really taken by it, and it was a movie that really touched me because I loved their music. I actually hated their music, but listening to that music after that film, I really loved it, and it was very popular. It was very, you know, but yet so intelligent and so original and so refreshing and so empowering. You know, like for me, who thought that filmmaking was the most expensive, it was like buying a diamond ring or something. It was something very far away. And looking at that film, it really seemed possible. And so the next day I woke up and I went and I found out who the director was, and I went to his office and I knocked on the door and I said, "Do you need an intern? I'll do whatever you need." And it was a time that that Todd was doing a movie called Poison, which was his first film. This is Todd Haynes, that's the name of the guy we're talking about. And so I was an intern in that film, and that's how I got into film, you know. And not thinking of directing. I worked as an assistant director, I did some casting, and I worked as an assistant editor for 2 years, because he spent 2 years editing the film, or a year and a half. And that's how I really tasted what making films was about. And I also don't think if I had ever stayed in Brazil, I would ever have made films. Because it's such a class system, you know? Film is for rich people, film is for people that can pay to go to university to study that. And I think it's very ironic that it was in the US and in New York that I actually had the opportunity to touch film. You know, I really remember the first time that I touched the celluloid, and working as an assistant editor was fascinating because it really sort of very physical, you know, like you cut it and you bring the little piece to the editor. And I just loved it. And I really wanted to be an editor, and I worked as an assistant editor for many years. And then I really, it was because of what was happening at that time that I thought, oh, maybe I can also make a film. There was a lot of people making experimental work and video work with their own means. And so I got a couple of grants, and then I made my first film, which I didn't think it was going to be a film. It was a documentary about my grandmother, who I deeply loved. And I got a grant, and I went to Brazil, and I shot with her. And that's how it all started. But it was never really a clear plan. I was diving into it in an ecosystem, in a context which was really alive, which was, you know, the independent New York film scene of the early 90s until like 94, 95.
What kind of atmosphere was it working with Todd Haynes, and what did you learn? You must have learned something.
It was wonderful. He was very generous, and he just opened. I remember he was just very generous. You know, he opened his doors of his house to me because he was editing. He had this apartment in Brooklyn. He was editing in the living room, or in his living room. So I would go there every day to help. And it was not only him; it was a community of people in New York at that time. And I think it had a lot to do, of course, with the AIDS pandemic. You know, there were a lot of people dying, a lot of people were angry, and a lot of people wanted to sort of, you know, talk about what they're going through. And queer cinema really started at that time. You know, what we know as the new queer cinema. So there was a lot of generosity from his part. He had a producer called Christine Vachon, who actually produced a lot of his films and other films. So she was really, really, really generous with me because I don't know, I was this Brazilian boy that was just like landing on their office, and they really trusted me and they really let me. So I worked with him for a while. I worked with her for a long time. That's how I learned all the Excel sheets and all the production and the numbers and all the very practical stuff of cinema. And there was a lot of other people at the time. You know, there's a lot of very interesting directors happening. And then I started to dream of making a movie, and that's why I made the movie that some of you saw here last night. You know, it was the first time that I flirted. So I made this movie about my grandmother. It was really wonderful, and it was a half-an-hour film, and I had a distributor that sold it, you know, in the US, and I paid my rent a couple of months with that, and so that really seemed like as a concrete possibility of something that I could live from.
Also in Brazil, there was like obviously the AIDS epidemic was happening in both countries everywhere. Then, could you see any difference how it was viewed in Brazil? Because Brazilians started making also queer cinema in the area, and you also made scenes.
Yeah, that's the film. Yeah. So what I did was, it was really rough in New York, and I think it was happening in Brazil, but it was very invisible, you know. And it was horrible at the time, you know, I'll tell it in a minute. But what I did was, it was so exciting being in that world at that time that I brought to Brazil, this is literally 30 years ago now, this month I think. I brought to Brazil a gay film festival that was being done in New York. I brought it to Brazil in the sense that I got all the tapes, I met the director, and we put all the tapes in a bag and we traveled. And me and a friend of mine, we did the first queer film festival there in 1992. And it was happening, the tragedy was happening there, but it was very hidden, you know, so you didn't really know if the people disappeared, so it was very different in New York. And bringing that festival to Brazil, it was really exciting because it really opened up a conversation that was necessary and very important. But it's ironic that it sort of started in the US. You know, my sort of awareness about it and my and what it did to me, really, as a filmmaker.
Let's have a clip of your first film, Madame Sapa.
Sure.
Yeah. So, ensimmäinen näyte, 3:5, sieltä kiinni. gives a nice example of one of your many talents of giving like violence and then incredible tenderness almost with side to side. This was a long time in making this film, your first film?
Yes, it was a long time. It was, as I was saying last night, there was about 10 years between 1994 I started to wanted to make it, and then we made it in 2000 we shot 2001, it was ready in 2002, so it was a long time to get it done. But it was okay, you know, like it was, I think, also as a moment that it was a really difficult moment in Brazilian cinema culture, because all the funding disappeared. Just happened 2 years ago again, but at the time it's all the funding disappeared, so it was a really difficult time. And I think it was also a subject. I remember meeting with the producer, and he's saying to me, like, you're completely out of your mind, like, you're making a first movie, it's a period movie, it has animals, it has kids, it's about a gay character, so it was like all the ticks, you know, that you want to shoot and do. And then when I heard that, I said, yeah, that's why I want to make it. So, you know, that's also why it took a long time. And I'm very fortunate, because I was looking at the credits now, and it did happen, because after a lot of no's, there was one Brazilian film director who was really, really incredibly, he was not helpful, he made it happen, called Walter Salles, who was really the reason that the film got financed. Because it was this movie, it was two movies actually that he financed out of his goodwill, which was City of God, and this movie, like, there was a deal with Canal Plus, and the film was actually produced mostly with French funding. And then the Brazilians came afterwards, but the French funding came because of Walter. So I really am very thankful to his understanding and love for the project. You know, but it was him that made things happen, because for many years it was a lot of yes, no's, and he was very instrumental in making it happen.
The lead actor, Lazaro Ramos, is very intense and wonderful in this film, but it wasn't your first pick, and Fernando Meirelles told a story about this, and we just want to make sure that he didn't lie to us, so that you tell your side of the story.
No, it's true. So I prepared this film for many years, and I prepared it in all possible ways. You know, I storyboarded it, I planned every shot of it, and I cast everybody, so I spent 3 years casting and doing auditions and so on. So there was a guy who was going to do it called Seu Jorge, who was a Brazilian singer and actor, incredible actor, really, just a really talented man. And I did an audition with him, which was mind-blowing, and it was clearly like the role for him. And he did it, and we started rehearsing, and Lazaro, who was the guy who finally did this movie, was doing a movie with Fernando, which was City of God. And at the end of the process, I couldn't work with Seu Jorge because he was like missing all the rehearsals. He was actually releasing a record, so he was trying to do two things at once. And then the producer says, we can't guarantee that we're going to shoot the movie with him, because if he doesn't come to the shoot, you know, it's a disaster. And so I was obliged to change actors last minute, literally 3 weeks before. I spent a year rehearsing with him, and 3 weeks before I said, oh, you got to change actors. Or then the movie stops, and I was not going to stop that movie. Like, we're going to go. And so I remember this audition I did with Lazaro many years before, and he really impressed me, but he was really young. But this is many years before, so he was a bit older. And I called him, or the producer called him, and it was really crazy because he came to do Madame Satã, and then Seu Jorge, Fernando picked Seu Jorge to do a big part in City of God. So, all for the better, I guess.
Worked very well. Wednesday there was a screening of Futuro Beach.
Yeah.
I want to ask, the sea and the beach, and you mentioned earlier already that where you lived, and what does beach and ocean mean for you?
It means, it's very interesting, because I was raised in a house which was literally, I would hitchhike for 5 minutes. I was in the beach, and it was a very important part of my upbringing. But So I come from a place, if you know the Brazilian map, it's like it's a corner. So I come from that corner. And if you look up, you look at Europe, and you look at the West, and you look at the North, right? So the sea for me meant this impossible border that I couldn't cross to go to the rest of the world, you know. So it was beautiful, but more than that, it was almost this horizontal wall that I could never cross to get to where I wanted to get, you know. Like I wanted to go to the big cities, and I wanted to meet different people, and I wanted to explore the world. So the beach was this really, again, contradictory space. It was this almost beautiful paradise. The sea was green and the sun was great, but yet it was this border that separated me from the rest of the world, and everything was so. It's interesting to come from the equator because you're actually in the middle of the world. But so everything's far. Like the north is far, the south is far. So São Paulo was really far, and then between São Paulo and Rio and me, there was the desert because I come from this very dry area, and then so was the desert and the beach. And where I come from is very interesting because it's the dunes, so it's literally the province I'm born in, it's called Ceará, and actually there is a theory that it means Sahara. So because it's very dry and the dunes go into the sea, and so the sea for me was a place of pleasure, but also a place that I needed to cross. And I think it's present in all I guess it's present in all my films. Thinking about it.
Invisible life starts at the beach and
It's
Marinheiro
true.
mountains, you're crossing the sea.
Yeah. It's the border. The sea for me was always this beautiful golden border that I needed to cross by any means, you know. So it was it's a very contradictory space.
And Private Futuro also deals with immigration.
Yeah.
In a very nuanced way, also dealing with the anger of those left behind. And you're living in Berlin for many years now. Like, what does it mean for you? It's a theme, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think I never really was happy at home, and I think I'm very happy where I don't feel at home. So I've always sort of chosen places that don't feel like home. So first, I really, it's very strange. I love being away. I think one of my favorite places in the world are airports. I love hanging out in airports, and I love missing connecting flights. I adore being stranded in airports during the winter because I just feel so free and liberated, you know. So I think all my choices have always been about. It's funny because growing up in Brazil with an Arabic name was always very strange because you never think that you are from there. Like people always looked at you and said, "Oh, where do you come from?" You know, such as people couldn't pronounce my name. So I've never really, and growing up gay in a city where I grew up gay, which is very homophobic, was also not the most fun thing in the world. So I think for me, my whole life has been about escaping home and being in places that. So I think, for example, the choice of living in Berlin for me was, I didn't realize at the time that it couldn't be farther for me. You know, it's Germany. I have no relationship to Germany. Like, I knew nothing about Germany, but it's such a pleasure to be in a place that, and I never really learned German. I've been there for 12 years and I studied German, but I can't really learn. And I think there's something about the fact that I'm not really there. So I think the feeling of not being at home is something that, it was very hard when I was growing up, but then when I grew up and I understood, I actually embraced it. It's a pleasure. It's a really incredible. I do love being here, for example, because it's so different and it's so foreign to what I know. I think there's something very comforting about it. But I think it has to do with this experience of being an outsider, always feeling like an outsider somewhere. And I think I just got used to it and I actually love it. I think there's something quite freeing about it, you know, not having roots and not having, and you know, when I was growing up, I could never tell because it's like everybody, I think it happened yesterday, I was at your house, I was at his house for a song, and so I said, so your name is Karim? I said, yes, where are you from? I said, Brazil, and people all go like, huh, really? I said, yes, my dad is Algerian, so it's always been, my experience of growing up, and you asked me about growing up, it's always been about not being from somewhere. And I actually learned to embrace it and like it very much. So the question of immigration has always been, you know, I come from a family where my mother really lived and died where she was born, but my father's family immigrated from Algeria to France. So I think like the idea of migration is something that is probably my DNA, you know, and I think that it's something that I've been very aware and concerned about, and I think it's not like I make movies about my life, but I think these things are very much present in every film that I make, because I think it's such an important part of who I am and the people I know, and I also think there was something that happened to me when I was growing up. So there was a part that I skipped about my life, which is I grew up in Brazil, and then when I was a teenager, I went to live with my dad in France. And this was the mid-80s, more or less. And it was really not fun. It was a moment in France, I mean, it's still a very racist place, but it was a moment in France where the first generation of North African immigrants were sort of growing up and they were teenagers, and it was really, really racist. And I stayed there for a year and I said, ciao, never again. And I think that really made a huge, it really marked me. You know, it was something that was really, you know, those things that happen to you in your late teenage years that are very, very violent. And so the question of migration is something that's been, I've made movies about it, I'm very concerned about it, and I'm very, it's a very important part of who I am really, for different reasons.
That explains a little bit also why you made a documentary about Tempelhof.
Yeah.
But let's have a last clip of a film playing tomorrow, The Invisible Life of Eurydice Guzmão, where they're escaping Brazil as well.
Yeah, it's true.
Screening of Mariner of the Mountains by Karim Aïnouz. Today in the morning discussion he spoke such beautiful words, such lovely remembrance of his mother, the importance, and today we're going to see a touching documentary, a very personal documentary about his mother. So let's please welcome Karim Aïnouz.
Thank you. I was actually worried because when Otto told me that the movie was going to play at 12:30, I thought at 12:30 at midnight people were going to see it, because it's a really slow movie. So I am happy. I hope you had coffee. I'm happy that you're having this movie for breakfast. It's a movie that I made during the pandemic, but it was not planned like that. But there was a lot that came to it because of the fact that I couldn't really travel. I hope you enjoy it. It's a very personal movie, but it is about my mom, but it's also about the Algerian Revolution and my sort of discovery of that revolution in my life. So I hope you enjoy it. I would love to hear your impressions afterwards. It's a movie that's very experimental and very free, so I would love to see how it hits you, or if it makes you really sleepy. Have fun and have a good voyage. It's a voyage. It's like a trip. So I hope you can travel with me, and I will be here afterwards. Thank you so much, and thank you for such a warm audience that we've been having here. Thank you.
Was that a starting point on this specific term?
Yeah, it was actually, we thought about this when we were editing the film. I mean, there was something about this term which is very colonial, you know, it's like this sense of entering the tropics and then losing yourself, and I thought there was a really good definition for what I was feeling going to Algeria. I felt very strange because I felt like I was going back home, but at the same time I felt like a colonial guy who was going to go and discover this place. So I thought there was an interesting, ambiguous word to set the temperature for the film. So it really was something that we found as I was editing more than before I began to think of the film. And it's an interesting, beautiful concept because it's very physical. So I thought I would put on the opening of the film just to set. It's almost like putting the temperature on before you watch a movie.
Yeah, because it's very personal, but then you get the bodily sensation as well. You mentioned earlier that in the morning discussion that you made this during the pandemic.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was funny because I actually wanted to make this film for many, many, many years,
and I got some money to go there, but the idea was to go and then go again. So this was a recce to the film. So I went there when I was finishing Invisible Life, between the moments for sound designing. I went there for 2 months, and I took a Super 8 camera, and then I had a friend of mine who came as a GOP a bit later. But the idea was to go back during the summer to do a proper shoot and to go back to the places we were going. But then the country was completely locked for about 2 years or a year and a half. So we couldn't go back, and the film became something completely different because I had no intention to put on archives in it, you know, like at least my personal archives. So it was interesting to be locked in the pandemic and doing this movie, and there was a deadline for me to deliver it, which was 2021. So I needed to finish it, and what happened was I started to go through all my personal archives, and so there's bits and pieces of every film, almost every film I've ever done, you know, that I found in my archives, in my Super 8 archives. So it was interesting how the film changed so much. And there's also the kind of film that I think I only made it because I was locked in, because it's such a personal and very kind of experimental. I mean, I didn't really know where I was going when I started editing. There was no voiceover, it was something very different. And I think the fact of being so focused on it for about a year, we spent a year editing it. So it was a very different object from when it began to the end. And I think it had to do with the fact of being so concentrated. And yeah, I don't know if it's better or worse, but it was just very different than the film I had imagined in the beginning.
Your father left Algeria basically during the war or after, and then he ended up in Brazil where there's a dictatorship. Do you know how he felt about that? Or?
It was more complicated. It's so I mean, the history of Algeria is so complicated. My dad left Algeria just before the revolution because a lot of Algerian, mostly men, were giving scholarships in the US because the US knew that the country probably would get independent, so a lot of people were trained and they went back to Algeria to build the country. So my dad never went to Brazil. So my dad and my mom, they broke up in the US. She went to Brazil and he went to Algeria. So he was never there. So it's very funny because I think one of my biggest, I'm not a resentful person, but I am quite resentful by the fact that we were raised in a country where the military were ruling, and then my dad went back to a country where it was the most exciting place in the world, probably, you know, just after the revolution. So he never tasted. He did taste it later on when the regime became sort of a one-party regime in the 70s and so on, but in the 60s, I've always dreamed to have been raised in this really incredible, thriving, it was so incredible what was happening in Algeria between 62 and 74, more or less. So, no, he got the good bit.
He avoided the conflict, but have you confronted him about this?
Yes, a few times. I think that it's hard to forgive, but it's easy to understand. I think as a young man who had been fighting for the freedom of that country for such a long time, to go back and be able to rebuild. My dad is an engineer, so he built he was involved a lot in the construction of the roads and the new roads that were built in the country. So I think it was probably, you kind of understand, you know, looking back, there was so much struggle to get there that I think he got caught in the joy of the revolution, I would say. And when I went, it was very interesting because when I went to Algeria, I went with this sort of very romantic idea of what the revolution was and what had happened. And I was confronted with a very different reality to what happened in the country throughout, you know, all the years between 62 and now, you know, basically 70 years, not 60 years ago. So it was very interesting. I went to look for this image I had. I always imagined that my dad, I think I say this in the movie, that my dad was this sort of guerrilla guy, you know, with a big beard and like, almost like Che Guevara, and he's the opposite of that now in the country as well. But I was also very lucky because when I went there, it was very interesting because this film is actually 2 films. And because when I went there in 2019, it was the beginning of the uprisings for democracy in Algeria, which was exactly a week after I arrived in Algeria. So I made another movie, which I don't think you've seen, which is, I made a movie with my cell phone when I was there, which is about this woman who was an activist. And it was really interesting because I went to look for this old revolution. And when I went to Algeria, there was so much happening in the streets of Algeria. So I made another movie at the same time with my cell phone, following one activist in, I think it was the 8th of March, International Women's Day, and people took the streets of Alger, and it was really, really beautiful. But that has been crashed because of COVID and everything. But I was very lucky to be arriving there at that moment.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for the beautiful film. I really enjoyed the playful tone of it, like with all the sound design and music and analytic editing by the time of it. How did you approach the tone? Was that something in your mind when you began shooting that you want to make playful and kind of quirky? Or
Yeah.
did that happen when you made it?
No, I wanted, I'm 56, and when I started to make this film, I just wanted to sort of go back to the beginning. When I started to make films, I was very, I always made films which were very experimental. I was never really interested in storytelling. I was more interested in sensations and sort of playing of of image and sound, and I really wanted to go back there, with this film. And I thought, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it again. But at the same time, when I was editing, I also felt that we needed a narrative thread. So I edited the film without any voiceover, just with the sort of sense of traveling and then playing with sound and images. And then I thought that it was important to have something for you to grab onto. So what I did was I worked with the same writer that wrote my last fiction film, and we transcribed. So when I was traveling, I was recording every day, what I was going through. Not to my mother, but to myself, really. And then we got all these recorded and we transcribed, and then he wrote this letter, which is very classically written in the sense that, there's a plot point 1, plot point 2. So it was this really interesting play of having something which is narrative and yet being completely free in the way that we edited. And there were moments when we're editing this that I thought, there is no movie, I'm going crazy, this makes no sense. But it was a really beautiful way of, and I think there's this movie and there's another movie I made a few years ago, which is kind of the same structure. And it was so much fun to do it, to sort of find the film and to write. It was really, really wonderful to be writing something that you had shot already, instead of writing something and then trying to adapt to something that you're going to shoot. And that was a really joyful experiment. And there were things that were very clear that should be there, but there were moments, for example, when we're color grading, for example, and I said, I want this image to be red, and I want this image to be green. And my color grader said, well, why? I said, I don't really know why, let's just try it. So I think it was a really fun process of merging storytelling with something which is, more playful than classic storytelling, in the sense that if I had gone back, I probably would have made a film which was much more square and much more cerebral than this film was.
Over there.
Thank you for the film. It was very personal, but it was also very universal. I've never been to Alger in my life, but after this film, I went there. It really went to all the places I would like to go, and the short clips and how it was edited was really a piece of art. You could actually smell the smell.
Oh, good. That's why I make films. No, thank you. I think, that's the only thing that I wanted with this film, is that you can actually sort of take the trip with me. And it was very tricky because at the same time it was very interesting going there, because in the beginning, they thought I was French. So it was like, we don't want you here, take the camera away. And then I said, no, but listen, I'm Brazilian. And like, oh, you're a brother, you come from a country which is the third world. And then when I said, but my name is Karim, and they said, and then when they found out that I was half Algerian, it was love, and it was like, celebration. But I was always very worried about, because I'm actually a complete foreigner as well. So I was very worried about the fact that I was making something which was a bit exoticizing. But I do think it is a bit exoticizing, but I think it's okay. And I think when I hear something like what you said, it was really the point of, I think it was two things which were very important. One was to have you travel with me and to sort of discover this country as I did. There's something magic about it. But also to talk about colonialism, and I think it was, for me, it was a really interesting way that I entered when I was making this film. It's like, how can I make something that's politically also relevant, historically relevant, but yet pleasurable, and that allows you to sort of discover this place, which is a place that's very hard to go. I don't know if any of you have been to Algeria, or if anyone are from Algeria, but it's very hard to get a visa. I mean, they're not very fond of tourism, so it was also a way to share this incredible country via film, really. So I'm good you smelled it. No, it's really important. It's really, really important. Yes?
Tuolla oli eka se siellä sivussa. Sielläkin oli. The one before.
Yes.
You mentioned Jean-Paul Belmondo as like your picture of your parents. Is this the scene that you were thinking?
Yeah, probably it is. Like, you know, and then what did he do like this with the moustache? And yeah, I always imagined he was a cross of Jean-Paul Belmondo and Che Guevara. You know, probably Che Guevara was more interesting than Jean-Paul Belmondo. But yes, there was a big. You know, it was a big sort of. It's funny to come here and see this picture because it was such an important film in the '60s and for my parents' generation. So yeah, but he doesn't really look like Jean-Paul Belmondo. It's more like a fantasy.
Nyt siellä portailla.
Thank you very much for the film. I would like to ask something about the position you take in this film because
Yeah.
you said in the morning that you enjoy being in places where you don't really feel at home.
Yeah.
On the other hand, here you're kind of searching for something.
Yeah.
You're actually searching for, I don't know if it's home that you're searching for, but
I was.
something. So I guess I'm kind of curious in how you feel your position as, like, both as a filmmaker, but also just as an Algerian, which was like, you were an outsider.
Yeah.
You couldn't really change that in a sense, but like making a film about your roots kind of will change your position. How did you feel that did change?
Yeah, I think it changed a lot. I think that at the same time, well, yeah, I mean, it would be not real to say that I feel Algerian because I haven't really lived there, but there was something that I felt very happy and very, really, really, really incredibly privileged to have had this history, even if it's not a history that I grew up with. It's something that I carry, and so I think there was something that I felt a big sense. I just felt really lucky to be able to come from two great places, and places with an incredible history and an incredible culture and an incredible people. So in a sense, I felt gifted by doing this trip that I could, because I spent my whole life saying. So I said this morning, like, where you come from? Oh, Brazil. Oh no, it's not true. You're Arabic. Oh yeah, I come from Algeria. So, but I could never say this with a full mouth. My mouth was never. I was never saying this, understanding what that meant. And so I think this is something that it's really something I took from making this film, which is you can be from many places and you can embrace different cultures, and this is a reason for celebration and not for exclusion. But I also felt that it's not my place. I mean, it is a place that I would never go back to live there, for example. So it was very enriching, especially at this age, to be able to embrace such different cultures and to feel like you belong to them, but yet you don't depend on them, let's say. So it was also very strange because when I got to Algiers, because of being Kabyle, like when I got to Algiers, I felt it was a big city. There was it was not hostile, but it was a rough city. And then when I went to the mountains, I felt something very strange, which was the sense of, there was a strange connection to that culture. And I kept thinking, this is biological? What is this? So there was also that going on when I was going there, and I think it is biological.
Siinä, joo.
Thank you also from my side. You said in the beginning that the film might be slow. I felt it was just full every moment. But my question is personal, so please, not appropriate, obviously, don't answer.
Sure.
But has your father's village or your village seen the film?
No.
And also, are you in touch with Ines still?
Yes, I am. It's so funny. I was thinking of her today. No, they have not seen the film, and the film, I really wanted the film to play in that village, but I wanted to be there. So I haven't been able to get another visa. The country has been blocked. So I haven't been back, and there's been a couple of requests for the film to play there, but I really want to be present. So it has not, but it will. And Inez is funny because we stayed in touch, and we sort of communicating via Instagram since I was there. And it was such a huge another gift, you know, of finding this. It's like the three girls were really great. And so, yes, we've been in touch, and I think they have seen the film because they told me that they had seen it and really loved it, but I don't know how. So I think it was probably through some French, because it played on French television, I think in February or March. So I think some people have seen the film through a bootleg version via TV, but I really would love to just go and share it with them, you know. But I will do it soon. I'm actually, hopefully, do it this year.
Vielä oli joku, jos siinä.
Two more questions. One was your mention about colors already.
Yeah. The what? The? Oh yeah. Yeah. So the colors. No, I mean I did something on this film which was really great. I had 3 weeks of color grading, which is the length you have normally for a fiction film, and I really insisted on having it because there was something quite painterly about it. So I was really experimenting with colors as I was grading. So that was not part of the material originally. And it was like writing a poem, you know, there are moments that you think you need more of this and less of that. So it was something that we did a lot in the grading. And the end, I just wanted, when I was making this film, I felt there was something to do with sci-fi in a way. I felt I was traveling to another planet or something when I went there. And I really wanted to bring, there's a few elements that I'm playing with all the time in the beginning, you know, the sounds of like, and then the rocket at the end. And then I just wanted, I had this feeling that when I left, I wanted to jump and sort of go underground in the sea and sort of access the country. That sounds a bit crazy, but I really wanted to sort of go underground and then go to the mountains through the sea and stuff. And so we got a seashell, and we went, and then we filmed virtually the seashell going into it, and that's how I sort of did. I always love to do end credits, and that with the music seemed to me that it also. I just wanted to have a sense of joy at the end. It was a hard experience, but it was very joyful as well. And then it was like trying something that would be impossible to do, which is this dream of going underground in the sea and going through the mountains. And so we did shoot a 3D seashell that we found and made the credits with.
More questions? Okay, I'll ask the final. No, Desasa jo. The other one.
This was the recce trip.
This was like when
Yeah.
the thing was shot on it, right?
Yeah.
But you had a cinematographer.
I did. I actually went with him I spent 6 weeks and he spent 2 weeks with me. So when he came, we shot a lot because I started to feel like I wouldn't be able to go back. So in the last 2 weeks, we shot a lot, and then I had some stuff to play with. Yeah. And
Sequences and meeting of your family in the village, those were shot by yourself.
yeah, most of them. Yeah, yeah. Not the ones I'm in the frame, but the other ones, yes.
That was
Yeah.
They were communicating with you and all that.
I had also.
Like, how did you manage to sort of lead the cinematographer out of the world?
Yeah, it's somehow there's a lot of this film. It's a really interesting question. There's a lot of it which is constructed, you know. So there's scenes. I mean, there's no scenes that I said let's do it like that. But the possibility of having had him when I went to the village allowed me to be quite free in that sense. So there was moments when he was with me that I could sort of step out and we had done a documentary together many years ago, not many years, a few years ago, so there was a really close relationship we had that allowed us to do this. One question I have for you guys, do you think, I was actually asking you all outside, do you think this film should have an English version on the voiceover? Because it's a lot of reading, right?
No.
Does that make it?
It's a personal film.
Yeah, I always have this sense when I show it, they're like, oh my God, we're going to have to spend an hour and a half reading Portuguese. English subtitles on Portuguese.
But
yeah,
it sounds so beautiful.
I think there's plenty of intimacy
that would be broken.
in English. But then again, I think Finns are pretty used to also, we grow up reading subtitles a lot, so it might be a different experience
Yeah.
for an American or something.
Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. Karim Aïnouz.
Sorry. Happy Sodankylä Prize 2022. Greetings from Sodankylä.